Hey, I'm your host, Mari Wagner, and you're listening to the Ever Be podcast, where faith meets lifestyle. I'm so excited you're here. Whether you're a new listener or a longtime follower, I know there's something here for you. Pull up a chair and listen in for insightful, real-life conversations and actionable steps on how to claim the full life God created you for. If you're a woman desiring to live a Christ-centered life in today's modern world, then this is for you. Welcome to Ever Be. Hey, Eve, welcome to Ever Be. I'm excited. Today's conversation, I think, is so needed, and I'm really looking forward to getting into it, all things chastity with you, because I think this is a topic that is commonly misunderstood, and there's so much more to it than just saying no or just a list of things that you have to wait to do until you're married. And so I'm excited to talk about it, clear the air, and just offer some encouragement to our listeners who may be struggling in this area as well. But before we jump in, why don't you introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit more about you?
Hi, I'm so excited to be on the Everbee podcast. My name is Eve Rosemary. I'm a 21-year-old chastity speaker. I'm from Wisconsin, but actually just graduated a month ago from Benedictine College in Kansas, where I was studying theology with a minor in entrepreneurship. And now I'm on a nationwide speaking tour telling teens all about chastity, and I'm using shrines as my roadmap actually. So I get to go to these shrines, these places of spiritual renewal, and then also share their stories, share the miracles that have happened there, especially during the Jubilee year in the Catholic Church. And then while I'm in those areas, I've been able to speak to thousands of teens about chastity, forming pure relationships, and striving for authentic love is really the heart of my mission, is so that everyone knows and feels the love of God and knows that they were intentionally and uniquely made by our loving Father.
That is amazing. Congrats. Congrats on graduating and just this accomplishment of taking your passions and just this whole endeavor full time. That's so cool to hear. And I'm a big supporter of people just chasing after their dreams, especially when it relates to the faith and bringing the faith into our everyday life. So we are so in sync there, and I'm so excited for you. Well, amazing. Let's jump in. Okay. I want to start off with the topic of love, because I think one of the root causes why chastity is misunderstood is because what love is, I think, is misunderstood in itself, right? Like what it actually is, and what we're feeling in different moments. Like, is it authentic love? Is it not authentic love? So, how would you define authentic love, and how do you feel like that authentic, that true love differs from the way that love is often portrayed in today's culture?
Man, the question, what is love, I think is the question that we're all asking ourselves and asking what love is. I think it's what we're all striving for. Like, we're all looking to be fulfilled. We're all looking to be chosen, to feel valued, whether that's in our careers, in our school life, and the extracurricular activities that we do. But truly, what love is, the greatest example that we have of this is Jesus on the cross, Jesus in the crucifixion. That is our very definition of love, is that selflessness, that generosity. In fact, I think so often when we think of love, we think of something that is easy, something that is effortless. But the truth of the matter is that if we know what real love is, that crucifixion, that was not easy. That was not effortless. What true, authentic love is something that we put in and day out. We put work into day in and day out so that we can learn how to love God. And what that is spending time with Him, spending time in silence with God. In fact, on my own podcast, I had a guest who was once asked, how do we know that we love God? And her answer was really simple. It was, how do you know that you love God? The desire to is enough. And that's something that's always stuck with me. The desire to love God is enough because the Lord wants to grant us the desires of our hearts. He does. He wants to see us filled with joy, filled with love, filled with peace. But if we want to get to know Him more, we have to spend that time in prayer with Him, actively loving Him, which doesn't always look like, you're not going to bring like flowers to Jesus. You're not going to be able to embrace Him in a hug like you would your normal friends, right? But yet, we have this really profound call to love God, to put the work in, to choose God day in and day out, whether that's through striving through virtue, avoiding sin, spending time in prayer. Because The fact is the greatest reality we'll ever face is when we're in prayer. Everything else, everything in our day-to-day life, we can't even recognize how wonderful and how beautiful it is if we're not spending that time in prayer. And so I think that prayer is love, worship is love, and love is sacrifice. That's our definition of love by Jesus on the cross. So love truly is sacrifice.
So I love what you said. And I think one of the ways that I've heard it described is that love is willing the good of the other. And that like true love is right. It's selfless. It's outside of yourself. It's truly willing what is good for the person that you love over what feels good to you. And I'm sure we're going to get into it, but we're going to realize that like what is truly good and holy for the person that we love is not what we experience a lot of the time or what we feel like the culture is telling us is love or is good for them. So I think it's really essential to look to God to understand authentic love. Can you talk to us a little bit about this? Like why should we be drawing this really like definition of love like from the Lord? How can this deepen our understanding of ourselves and what we're made for and what love really is?
Well, if you want to know more about something, you have to look at where it came from and what made it, right? So, if I wanted to know
Mhm.
more about like the watch that I'm wearing, I could go to look at the manufacturer and learn more about the product itself. But the same concept applies to us. If we want to know more about ourselves, we have to look to who made us, who created us, and that's this loving Father. But we also know that this love is within us that we're desiring, and this is a universal experience. Like we are all searching for love in different ways. If you look at the movies that we watch, the books that we read, the television shows, I don't think I've ever read or watched something that didn't have some sort of love plot line. Like love is just something that is innately in us. And if we can recognize that that love is innately in us, that means it has to come from something. And so if we want to know more about that love, right, we have to look at who made it. So if we have love, the person that created us is therefore then the definition of love because they gave us that love themselves. And I
Mhm.
was just thinking about this today, like why does it matter? Why does all this matter? Why does prayer matter? And it's because like we matter, our faith matters, but we have the opportunity to go beyond living an ordinary life to living an extraordinary life, but we can only get that by knowing who Jesus is, embracing that, and getting to know the root of where our love comes from so that we can in turn love more purely and more genuinely in our lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is beautiful. So, what do you feel like is distracting people from, like the true love of the Lord, right? And like viewing love in the way that the Lord wanted it for us. Like, what do you feel like is the biggest pull away from that?
Wow. I mean, there's so many factors that goes into it. And for me, like chastity's just really been the way that I mean, it's the most clear manifestation of how we love is a lot of times in our relationships, and we can see
Mhm.
so much of a promiscuous society, and that indicates that we're not learning how to love in the right way. And I don't want to point everything to social media because I think that can be a really powerful tool, but I think it has really influenced the way that we view ourselves and our own insecurities that we do feel the need to turn to other people in order to find the gratification that we're seeking and the love that we're seeking. Even for me, I've been through a whole journey of learning how to love myself. I've been through a lot of health challenges and a lot of insecurities even before that. Heck, I competed in Miss America when I was younger. I was Miss Wisconsin's Teen 2021. Like I was in an environment where my worth was defined in whether I walked away with a crown or not. And for me, that was, Miss America, that was the crown. But for all of us, we all have that thing that we feel like we're defined if we walk away with this or with this. And that's not the truth because the truth is that God loves us before any of that is there. He loves us before we have the crown on our head. He loves us before we have figured out how we want to do our hair or how to do our makeup. Like the little. I think it's the little moments of our day where we start turning to objects to tell us where our worth comes from. That all adds up to not understanding the way that God loves us. And so if we allow ourselves the room for silence. And maybe that's kind of where the social media and phone usage comes in, is that we don't allow room for silence. We don't allow room for ourselves to reflect. And Socrates himself said that the unexamined life is not worth living. And we don't give ourselves the opportunity to really examine our lives. So, therefore, we're not seeing the ways that we're loving, the things that we're choosing to love over God. And so I think it takes time of allowing yourself silence, going to Eucharistic adoration, and just putting yourself before God, whether you have something to say to Him or not, just putting yourself before God so that you can really examine where God is in the everyday moments because He's there.
Yeah, that was a beautiful answer. I think one of the things that stuck out to me the most too was just this whole theme of like putting our worth in something else and, seeking that love that we are seeking in our hearts in return from that thing that's not truly the true source of love. And I think we can do this so often in relationships. I mean, I relate to a lot of your story and a lot of what you experienced in high school and maybe college is, I feel like, what I experienced as well in those
Mhm.
years. And what a lot of people experience, right? There's so much focus on relationships, on the boys and how am I going to be loved and perceived and where's my worth lie and how can I reassure myself that I am worthy, that I am beautiful, that I am loved. And I think that when it comes to relationships and dating, we just often don't have the right mindset in approaching it. We're approaching it almost to seek maybe just like a pleasure, like you said at the beginning, a fun time. Maybe it's just to seek validation and worth in who we are. But really, we should be approaching dating with the mindset of marriage. And I know that this is something you feel passionately about as well. So, can you just share, like, how can people really approach dating with a mindset of marriage rather than just for fun or seeking for validation in their worth and their beauty?
Yes, I think it really first comes down to laying the foundation for what you're looking for, but also who you are. So, a fun story for me is that I remember my senior year of high school, I had kind of considered dating this guy, and he hadn't waited for marriage in the past. And I obviously was very adamant about this decision for myself that I wasn't going to settle, that I wasn't going to change my values. And so we had a lot of conversations about waiting for marriage and what that meant to me. And in the end, the relationship obviously didn't work out because he wanted something more physically intimate, and I was not willing to lower my standards for that. And I remember walking away from that and just thinking to myself, like, man, I was really about to settle with this relationship, and I don't think it's what God would have wanted for me. It's not who I really wanted to be with. It was more of just dating for fun rather than truly dating for marriage. So I went home and I made a list of, I think this list is up to like 60 or 80 things of qualities that I'd want to look for in a future husband. And I wasn't going to settle for anyone unless they had accomplished or been striving for all of the virtues on this list. Again, I understand that that's a high standard. Like 80 things for a guy to meet is a high standard, but they didn't necessarily have to be at that point, but they had to be working towards those virtues. And so I made this list. I prayed over this list every single day. And after praying over this list for a while, I realized that I wasn't the woman that I needed to be to meet this man either. So I then made a list for myself of qualities of the woman that I would want to be in a future marriage for my kids someday. And these qualities ranged from things of being generous to learning how to spend my money well or learning how to budget. It was really anything that would benefit me in a marriage and looking towards who God's calling me to be. And then, so now I had these two lists side by side of the qualities that I was looking for in a man and the qualities that I needed to become myself. And and together these qualities would be able to lead me to a relationship that was oriented towards marriage. That doesn't mean that every person that I date I'm going to marry, right? But it does help me discern when I'm considering dating somebody, is this relationship, is this person matching these qualities? And also, am I still working towards these qualities? Are they bringing out even the qualities that are on my list to make me a better person? So, I think if we approach dating that intentionally, we're so much more likely to end up with the spouse that we're looking for. Or when we're actually dating for marriage, we're with someone who is not just going to tolerate the values of waiting for marriage, but actually want to uphold them themselves and push you to be a better person. And I think if we're really going into dating with that mentality, you're going to have a better success rate at finding that person more quickly.
Yeah, that was such good, like, helpful, practical information and practical tips. I did something very similar. I, like, wrote down a
Mhm.
list in the virtues that I was looking for, and I've recommended that to many women, and I think it is really helpful, especially if you are in a season where maybe you're struggling to stick to your standards or you're struggling to like discern like is this somebody that I'm supposed to be with or not that is good for me?
Mhm.
I think honestly having a tangible list is super helpful to keep your standards to kind of go back to and have something like written down for yourself that you're like, yeah, like I can stack these people up
Mhm.
against what I'm praying for, what I'm hoping for, and not in a judgmental way truly, but just in a way
Right.
that protects you and your heart and your
Mhm.
future marriage. And then something also that you can pray with. I think it's so important to pray specifically to the Lord for these big prayers and know that He desires to answer those desires of your heart. And
Mhm.
so having a list that you can bring to prayer and bring to the Lord and be like, Lord, I'm really praying for a man like this, XYZ. I even went so far as to say that I wanted him to have nice light eyes and good teeth. And it was so funny. One of the first times I met Trey, I like noticed his smile. It was like such a big smile. He has really big,
Oh.
nice white teeth. And I was like, wow, he has really good teeth. And, I ended up marrying him. So the Lord cares. The Lord
He
cares about these little
does.
details. He cares about your desires for a future husband. So that is such a good practical yeah thing to implement. Now I think
Mhm.
one thing that I want to make sure that we catch and talk about is like how do we make sure that bringing us or that how can we make sure that dating and like pursuing the person that we desire to marry can bring us closer to God rather leading us to idolize the person that we're dating. And I think when we have this list of virtues, it can be really easy
Mhm.
to begin to just like idolize this person instead of viewing like this process of finding your future spouse as a way that is bringing you closer to God. Do you know what I mean?
Yes, absolutely. That's a great question too, or a great place to start because something I always think about is that dating isn't meant. Dating is meant to bring you closer to God, not make someone else your God. Right? Like we
Mm.
should be dating for the intention of marriage, but really what that is a vocation. It's a path to God. It's a path to heaven. That's what our
Yes.
vocations are meant for. It's whatever is God sees fit for us as the clearest way to get to heaven. And so when you're in that dating relationship, think about, how much time am I spending with, like, is this person bringing me closer to God? Like, is this person from the get-go someone whose their faith is strong? I think your faiths do have to be strong before getting into that relationship to be able to guide each other to God closer. I always say, look for someone who's going to hold your hand to heaven. That's the goal. When you're dating somebody, is finding someone who is your path to heaven, but you don't want to cross the line where this person then becomes your God, because the intent is to actually get to God, not to make that other person your God. And so I think having clear emotional boundaries is something that's really important for this. A good rule of thumb that I always encourage people with is that you shouldn't talk in the future for longer than you've already been dating. So, say you're dating someone for 2 months, you shouldn't talk in the future for longer than 2 months. And I'm not saying don't have the conversations about, like, oh, this is how many kids maybe I'd want to have someday, or this is the career and these are my aspirations. But there's a difference in talking about what you desire and talking about what you desire with that specific person. So just talking in the future for as long as you've been dating, versus getting caught up in the moment, caught up in the honeymoon phase. Then all of a sudden you're talking about marriage and you've only been dating a couple months, and then maybe things don't go so well, or now you do start idolizing the person because our emotions are really strong, right? We do have this really wonderful capacity to love because, again, God is love. And that's where that comes from. But I think we have to check ourselves a lot and have maybe relationship check-ins where you have the tough conversations about, okay, where are we at as a couple, but where are we both at with our faith? Where are we at with our friendships? I think that's a really good indicator too of, is this person good for me? Are they also helping me get closer to my friends? Or have my friendships kind of pittered out a little bit more as we've been dating for a longer amount of time? I think that's also an indicator of maybe some idolization. So there's a lot of little things that we can be aware of in that relationship. But just knowing that your faith doesn't suffer because you're in a relationship with someone else. I think so often we look at the stories of the saints and it's like, oh, I can't be a saint unless I'm a nun, or I can't be a saint unless I'm a priest. And that isn't true. Like, we all have the capacity to be saints in our everyday life. We all have the capacity to live an extraordinary life with God. And if that is our focus and our priority, when these other things come into play, like relationships, friendships, career, those will fall into place in our lives naturally because we put our
Mhm.
faith first. So just really keeping a tab on the other parts of your life. Okay, am I spiritually healthy? Am I physically healthy? Emotionally healthy? As you go along in the relationship, I think is really helpful.
That is, yeah, really helpful, really true. And I think there's just something so powerful about living a rightly ordered life. And that means that we are putting the things in the correct priority that the Lord called for them to be in. And so knowing that, yeah, this relationship is important, but even though like this is a person you love the most right now, the Lord is still number one in your life. And
Exactly.
continuing to cultivate your relationship with the Lord and your faith above anything else is going to make sure that all those things are kept in the right priority and that you don't end up idolizing your boyfriend, your girlfriend, the person you're in a
Right.
relationship with. So yeah, keeping the Lord first in your life is super important. I think another thing too that I want to talk about is, and that I think plays a role in how we live out chastity or how our perception of chastity really changes is how we view ourselves and kind of like
Mhm.
our relationship with our own like physical bodies. And I think in the conversation of chastity, it's really common or really easy to fall into these thoughts of like, oh, well, then my body must be bad. If my physical body like desires these things, like it must be bad then, because the church and the Lord like says that these things like are not good. And that's all just like misconceptions, right? So why is it important to see our bodies as good and meaningful? And how does this like understanding impact the way that we love and relate to others?
Yes, so I want to point back to an experience that I had my freshman year of college because while this might not be directly correlated with chastity, I think it gets to the heart of our view of ourselves. So my freshman year of college, obviously, had just gotten to college, new start, new life. At the same time as starting my freshman year of college, I also was Miss Wisconsin's teen. And during that year, I had gone from being Miss Wisconsin's teen, winning the overall fitness award at Miss Wisconsin's teen, going to Miss America's teen, having the best experience, and really, really growing a lot myself. And then starting my year at college, started facing all of these health challenges. I was gaining weight really rapidly. My face shape changed. I was losing hair, and I didn't know why. And
Mm,
as I was going through these experiences, it was the first time that I had seen my body change so much in a very short amount of time. And
mm,
knowing that I was, trying to make new friends, trying to meet people, going to a great Catholic college where there's a lot of cute Catholic boys on campus, and all of these things coming together, I was in such turmoil of trying to understand my body and not knowing what was going on, not knowing what my health challenges were. And I remember the mass was a place of such safety for me in that moment where I would go to mass. I had such bad fatigue that the mass was really the only place that I found I could pray well because you can sit and you can stand, and I don't have to worry about sitting there in adoration for too long and falling asleep. And so I would go to the mass, and I remember I would sit there and just be in such turmoil. I just did not like myself so much, honestly. And I would sit there and I would listen to the part of the mass where the priest holds up the body and blood of Jesus and says, "This is my body given up for you." And every time I heard those words, it felt like I was saying it back to Christ. Like, okay, like I don't know what's wrong with my body. I don't like my body right now, but like if the Lord is up there on the altar saying, "This is my body given up for you," like there must be something really profound about the body
mhm,
and something really good about the body that has to mean something. And if that means something, that means that my body also means something. And as I began to reflect on it more, I realized that whenever I viewed myself as so I don't know. I just didn't really didn't like myself, and would view myself so much less than I should have. And I would just think about how much that hurt Christ's heart to know how I was viewing myself, to know how I was talking to myself. And it all comes down to like, this is the body that God has given me. This is the body that He has given me to bring Him closer to Him. Like, this is the means of love He has given me to love other people, to love Him better. And in a way, like, how dare I not appreciate that gift? That gift of like, this is my body is my living testimony of God's love for me. That I wake up every single day, and whether my body is working as it should, whether my thyroid is working as it should, like all of that, like this is my testimony. This body is my testimony. And it made me appreciate the body so much more because like Christ truly does say like, this is my body given up for you. That has to mean something. And we can look at that in all of our lives. Like I encourage people that when they sit in the mass to think about that line and what does that mean for your life? Like what does it mean if Christ gave up his body for you? How does that change your life? Because our lives should look different because of that one line in the mass. I mean the whole mass, but specifically that one part in the mass where the priest says like, this is my body given up for you. And we say the same thing to Christ when we our sacrifice those physical temptations in relationships. That when I'm dating someone for a few years and we want to take the next step, but we're not married, like, well, God, like this is my body given up for you. I'm going to push past this temptation, not fall into this temptation, even when we really love someone, because this is my body given up for you, God. Like this is my purity, and I recognize the gift that you've given me in my body, and I want to honor it and serve you with it.
Wow. You've got me, like, tearing up over here. I'm just,
Oh,
like like, unexpectedly, like, so moved by everything you're saying. I mean, like,
thank you.
it's true, and it's just such a beautiful reminder that, like, even when, whether you struggle with self-esteem and recognizing your beauty, or if you struggle with, yeah, health complications that make it really hard to understand and love your body, like,
Mhm,
whatever it is such a good reminder. Gosh, you said it so beautifully of just like your body is like a testimony of God's love for
mhm,
you. Like your body is a testimony of just yeah, just like how much the Lord like adores you and loves you that and he brought you into existence and truly like um not just criticizing but really like hating our bodies is yeah, just, hurting the Lord and, like,
mhm,
hurting our relationship with him, and I love the thing that you said too about how, like, the Lord created our bodies, and, like, this is, like, our vessel on earth, right? Because we are body and soul, like, he created this vessel on earth for us to become closer to him, and whatever our struggle is with our physical body, whether that's health issues, whether that's struggling and falling in chastity and purity, often, the Lord has created this vessel for us to be good, to bring us to Him, and to make us saints and to increase in holiness. So that was just a really beautiful reminder. Thank you for sharing that. Um, let's shift gears a little bit. I think it's really easy to talk about this conversation in the context of faith and our relationship with God and how God has ordered love and what his plan is for love in our lives. But I know that there are a lot of non religious reasons
mhm,
why waiting to have sex till marriage is beneficial. And I think it's important that we talk about that because I know that when I started to learn about that, when I was in high school and college and kind of just like, yeah, making these decisions for myself of like, what is chastity? Like, what am I going to do? What am I not going to do? What does the faith say? What is like the not faith say? Like, are there any like real reasons, besides just my Catholic faith that I like should not be having sex till marriage? And I remember listening to a Jason Everett talk where he like broke some of those down and those were really convincing to me. So can you, if you know any of those,
mhm.
can you share yeah, just like what are some of these non-religious reasons that you feel like waiting for marriage is really beneficial?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, biologically, like we can look at this from a biological perspective. which is one of the most like clear cut reasons of why to wait for marriage. And a really interesting part of the human person is that for a woman, the chemical that's released during physical intimacy, that chemical is only released 3 times in her entire life. And that's when she's physically intimate, when she's giving birth, and when she's breastfeeding. Okay, if this
Mhm.
chemical is only released those 3 times, it's the same. It's a chemical in in the brain, and it's almost like if you were to have a cup of coffee. Well, that cup of coffee, that caffeine is going to be the strongest the very first time that you have a cup of coffee. If this chemical in the brain functions the same way, which it does, then the first time that you're physically intimate, this chemical is going to be released the strongest. So if you want a marriage that has a better chance of lasting, maybe
Mm.
saving yourself for marriage is one of a clear cut way to help bond yourself physically to this person in a way that, it's the strongest the first time that you are physically intimate. So why not make the strongest time with the person that's promising to spend the rest of their lives with you? And also then it makes it easier to go to breakups, right? Like not everyone that you date is going to be your person. So the easier that you can one find out if this person is your person, but two, if they're not your person, if you haven't been physically intimate with them, it's a lot easier to end that relationship and then move on as a result towards finding your future spouse if you haven't been physically intimate because of that chemical connection. But also, if you're in school still and you have to walk around and see that person on campus, like that's a really hard thing to go through. And you're saving yourself a lot of emotional turmoil just by waiting, even though it's a difficult decision to make. But also thinking about there's no worry about being pregnant. For women, the decision to not wait for marriage is not just like a 1 day decision, it is the riskiest decision you could ever make. Right, because if this decision ends in having a child, that's an 18-year minimum commitment. It's not just a one-night ordeal. It's an 18-year-long minimum commitment. That's the riskiest decision a woman could make for herself. So really thinking
Mhm.
about that, is this person even who I want to have children with? Is this the right time to have children? And most likely if you're not married, it's maybe not quite the right person yet, or it's not the right timing for you yet either. So thinking about that, I think it also helps you find your spouse a lot more quickly because it leaves the room for really genuine conversations to happen. If you're not distracted by the physical, you can have really deep conversations with that person. If it gets awkward, you're not just turning to like kiss each other to make up for the awkward silence or something. You're
Totally.
just allowing yourself to enjoy spending time with them, but also you'll never have to feel used in a relationship. Most likely, it's really difficult to feel used in a relationship if you're not physically intimate. So, by saving yourself for marriage, you're allowing yourself the opportunity to get to know the person for who they are and also take confidence that if they're with you, they simply enjoy spending time with you. They're not with you because they can get anything from you. And for me, those are kind of just some of the basic reasons of non religious reasons to wait for marriage. But obviously, I hope that even people who aren't religious can have the view of their body as something that's meant to be protected and meant to be preserved, and that's something that's valuable, especially as women, where our bodies are something that's going to hold life and be the bearer of our families someday. So, with that understanding, like knowing that virginity is something to be protected, your heart is something that's to be protected, and then saving it as a result for your future spouse so that you can have a stronger marriage. You can have a stronger family because you've built the foundation of an emotional and intellectual connection first, right? Just because you're not being physically intimate doesn't mean that there's no intimacy in your relationship. You still have
Yeah, totally.
emotional and intellectual intimacy that you're going to grow in, and then the physical aspect can come about when you're finally married because then that's, when the chemical gets released, that's where you are physically bonded to one another. And I think that's just a really beautiful way to set up a marriage and a family.
Yeah, totally. I really recommend too if people want to learn more. That talk I was referring to earlier, I believe it's called Green Sex by Jason
Mhm.
Everett. And I don't know if that's like the name of the specific talk or a series of talks. I literally just remember my mom giving me a like Lighthouse Media CD when I was in high school, and she was like, "Listen to this." And in that talk, he talks more about this, more of those non-religious reasons, and he brings up some real statistics, which I don't have memorized, so I'm totally not going to try. Release marriages, like divorce rates, how
Mhm.
sleeping with multiple partners and living together before marriage impacts divorce rates and how
Yes.
long people stay married. And so I thought that was really interesting and really recommend people to look into that. Now, let's just chat a little bit about what advice we would give to somebody who is maybe really struggling in this area. Because if we're being real, chastity is really hard, especially when you've been dating someone for a really long time, or maybe when you're in a group of friends that don't have those same values. And the norm of the group is kind of just to, be with multiple people or be
Mhm.
loose about your physical boundaries. And especially in like college environments or young adults, it gets really hard, and I've experienced that myself. And I just feel like we should talk about maybe like what are some practical advice that we can give for people who are struggling in this area to keep their values and standards high in today's dating culture.
Yeah, well, first things first, you really have to nail down why you've made this decision to wait for marriage. So, I would encourage people to read about reasons to wait for marriage. There's a lot of really wonderful books from Jason Everett, Christopher West, Sarah Swafford, some really phenomenal authors that if you're able to read or listen to the audiobooks, I would really encourage that so that you can uh, really intake what that information is and let it implant in your heart so that you can become really strong in that value. Listen to podcasts if you're someone who likes listening to podcasts about it, just so that you can nail down and know exactly why you've made that decision to wait for marriage, because then it's going to be so much easier to explain it to other people, to explain it to the person that you're dating, maybe that friend group that doesn't quite understand.
Yeah.
Even if you are in a friend group that doesn't understand, know that your example does so much for your friend group. The fact that you're willing to go against the culture and go against the grain to make the decision to wait for marriage, that speaks volumes, and it's going to make your friends really curious as well as you have more conversations. So make sure that you know why you've made the decision to wait for marriage, whether that's for you writing that down or just really reflecting on why you've made that decision to wait for marriage, what your faith means to you. Also know that the decision to wait for marriage, it's not a no, it's a yes to something so much greater. It's a yes to a
Mm.
greater love for yourself. It's a greater love for God. It's a greater love for your future vocation. So if you're currently struggling with that and in a relationship, my encouragement to you would be to have a really tough conversation with whoever you're with to talk about more physical boundaries that you can have. That's not just not having sex, it's like going beyond that. So even on your worst day, your most lustful day, you can still hold by your value to wait for marriage because it's not easy. But the closer and closer we get to crossing a line or crossing that value, the harder and harder it is to wait for marriage. I give this example in my own chastity talk, and it's one of like the favorite parts of these kids' talks, where I have a kid come up and they hold a bowl, and I pour M&Ms in the bowl, and then I pour like Reese's Pieces in the bowl and top it with whipped cream, and like they're holding this huge bowl of candy in their hands. And I asked them, like, is it easier to eat the bowl of candy when it's in your hands or if I'd kept it behind the podium where they didn't even know it was there? Well, of course, it's easier to eat the candy when it's right in their hands, when there's something right in front of them. And I think it's the same thing with physical intimacy. The closer and closer we get to it, that it's like sitting right in front of us, the harder and harder it is to wait for marriage. So if it's something that you're struggling with, pinpoint those things that make you struggle with it more. It's not even just in your relationship, it's the things that you listen to, it's the things that you watch on TV, it's the conversations that you have with your friends. Really pinpointing and being aware of the things that are going on in your head, I think is something that's crucial in making this decision to wait for marriage. Because again, it's not just being in a relationship, it's all the things in your day to day lives of how am I respecting and honoring my body? How am I respecting and honoring my faith from the day to day moments? I also would just encourage anyone that's struggling with chastity, like from the get go, like God's mercies are new every single morning. Like every single day is a decision, is a day that you can make a different decision for yourself. And that's a beautiful thing about the faith. In fact, there's a story of a saint who you might have, I've heard this story before, but she wanted to build a church. And so she went to the priest and said, God told me that I need to build a church. And I think it was actually the bishop she went to right away. But the bishop said, okay, if this is something that's really from God, pray about it and ask God what my last sin was, the last sin that I confessed was. So this nun goes back and she prays and she asks God, like, okay, what was this bishop's last sin? Something very bold to ask someone, by the way.
Yeah,
Like, I don't think I would
absolutely
want anyone to know that information,
scary.
but very bold of the bishop to give her that command. But this story is really incredible because the nun then comes back to talk to the bishop, and the bishop's like, okay, sister, like, what was my last sin? And she tells him, like, I don't know. God doesn't remember. And that's a really profound example of what confession does, of what the sacrament of reconciliation does, that it wipes us clean. God does not remember our sins. He does not hold that against us, especially when we go. The intent of going to confession is going and confessing a sin so that you resolve to never commit that sin again. That's the goal. That's why we go every single time that we go to confession, to seek that union with God again, so that we can have the strength to continue to live out that virtue. So if that's something that you're struggling with, I would encourage you to go to confession, confess that sin, and as much as you can, go back to the same priest. That time and time again, it's a nice slice of humble pie every single time that you have to go back to the priest and admit to the same sins. That's something that's really powerful. If it's also committing a sin with a partner, both of you go to confession in like the same, hour, the same space with the same priest. You don't necessarily have to walk into the confessional at the same time. That's not what I'm saying, but just going and knowing that you're holding each other accountable to this. And that's also something that it's just almost like another accountability partner with this priest, of having that with you. And then if it's something that you're still struggling with, I'd encourage everyone to do the consecration to Saint Joseph, and also the consecration to Mary, that you're entrusting yourself, your body, and your purity to these wonderful examples of virginal love, of pure love, of love that was patient and willing to give of their lives to one another. We can always look to Mary and Saint Joseph as these examples, and you can also do 30-day long consecrations to them to help give you the grace and the power that you need within yourself to be able to hold true to these values.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing you were saying that I think is really important to point out is the whole idea of like the closer you are to
Mhm.
whatever it is, the harder it is to say no, right? And to grasp
Yeah.
at it. And so, just a few like practical boundaries that are important or could be helpful to implement in your relationship, just to add to the conversation here. Um, One of them is like setting a curfew. And I know that that
Mhm.
sounds really stupid when you're in college or older and you're like, why do I have to set a curfew for myself? The whole point is that I'm free now from my parents. But like, it's really helpful, and we did that in our relationship too. Trey and I, we were
Mhm.
dating in college, and it's hard, like when you're living in a house with friends or in a dorm, and you really have to like be accountable for yourself. If you don't have like a friend who's like helping you be accountable, and so setting like boundaries like that, like okay, we're gonna have a curfew, like we don't hang out
Mhm.
past 10 p.m. or 9 p.m. or whatever it is, because after that you get tired, you start cuddling on the couch, you start laying on the couch, like and one thing leads to another and it gets harder and harder. Another thing I've heard people have done is like 4 feet on the ground at all times. And so that means like both people's feet have to be on the ground. Both feet have to be on the ground for both people at all times. So you're not like you're basically just sitting normally, like, you can't lay down and cuddle or anything like that. Again, you have to know your limits and know what is the thing that's going to lead you, to lust or to lead you to sin physically with, yeah, the person that you're with. So those are just a few, like, practical things that I feel like are helpful too. I love what you said about confession. I think it's so important to just, like, continue to go back and not give up, and holding that both at the same time as not just using it as a crutch, like truly striving and truly like just doing everything you can to fight the good fight, to keep going with your virtue and your purity and chastity. But at the same time, like if you fall, like please run to confession. But don't just use it as a crutch. Don't just think to yourself, oh, well, I'm just going to go to confession tomorrow. So, like, I can do this as many times as possible because I'm just going to go to confession tomorrow. And if that's what you feel, like pray through that, and ask the Lord to allow you to feel the true weight of yeah, just like this sinfulness that you might be living in. Because the more that we like are revealed the true weight, the more that we see the truth of what we're experiencing and how far from love it really, really is. And I know that one thing I've heard too, and that I've shared with my audience is true love won't send you to the confessional. And now that's not to say the person you're with, if you're struggling, is not the person you're supposed to marry, right? But if there is like no true desire from both ends to help each other fight for purity, that's not true love because you're constantly sending each other to the confessional. So just keeping that in mind when you're discerning like your relationship and dating for marriage, like who has those similar values as you, who is willing to fight with you to stay chaste, so that you guys can, yeah, take each other to heaven, as we were talking about earlier. One thing that came to mind as you were talking when you were mentioning like the vows on the altar, and it just reminded me when I was not in the process of dating, but just like discerning, marriage and dating different people. One thing I always reminded myself of in my commitment to wait till marriage was when you go up on the altar and say your vows and you say, I will commit myself to you, I will love you in sickness and in health and all this, whatever, for all the days of my life. You make the vows for all the days of your life. And all the days of your life includes every day before you were married, but every day before that moment on the altar. And so just as an encouragement, like take that to prayer and take that to heart, and make that commitment for your future spouse, because all of the days of your life includes today. Even if you haven't found the one yet, even if you're not on the altar yet, even if you're not ready to vow, your whole life, to one person, the decision you make now is still part of those vows to your future spouse, that you vow to, give yourself completely to them every day of your life. So that was just something that, yeah, that really helped me, and that kind of was encouraging for me in my season of dating and waiting till marriage. Eve, thank you so much for coming on today. So where can we follow along on your podcast, on YouTube or Instagram? Where can people find you?
Eve's Wi-Fi had a little bit of trouble here, so we lost her response at the end of this recording, but don't worry, I got you. You can find more about Eve on Instagram at theeveryday.saint, and her podcast is called The Everyday Saint Podcast if you want to hear more from her.
Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing in this area and just the way that you're serving the Lord with your gifts. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Thank you so much for listening in. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and on social media, and give me a 5-star rating on whatever podcast platform you're listening on. That helps me and the show out so much. Also, make sure to follow the podcast on Instagram at EverBePodcast. And if you want more content like this and you don't already follow me, you can also follow me on Instagram at mari.c.wagner. And may his praise ever be on our lips. God bless.